Thank you very much. And thank you for that short introduction, because I talk too much, so I'll try and get through this talk. My presentation, I think, is going to be a little bit different in terms of content from the ones we heard earlier in this session, which were very much focused on research results. I'm going to be focusing on methodology, so slightly different. This is a methodology. It's called the Replace approach. This was a methodology that's been developed over 5 years as part of a Daphne-funded programme, which was just finished, actually. It finished earlier this year, basically promoting change towards the abandonment of FGM in practicing communities in the European Union. Okay, I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. The approach that we've come up with, we've called the Replace approach. I'll explain that a bit later. So for those of you who are perhaps new to this topic, I just thought I'd start with a definition. I'm sure everybody knows the definition of FGM, but I've put it up just to remind us. And I just focus on the fact that it's all procedures for non-medical reasons. Okay? That's the WHO definition. So just to remind us of what we're talking about. Before I get into the methodology stuff, just to give you some facts and figures. Again, I'm sorry if this is repeating what you already know, but I just think it's important to bring us all up to the speed, because there may be people here who don't know much about female genital mutilation. I'm a geographer. Yes, you good. I'm a geographer, so I have to have a map in everything I do, otherwise I don't feel my identity is complete. So map of prevalence of female genital cutting, and clearly the countries in red are those that have the most serious prevalence rates of over 50%, and in some countries 99% of women have been subjected to FGM, particularly in the Horn of Africa. What usually surprises people is it's often seen as an African issue or from communities coming from high prevalence countries living elsewhere, but we have a huge area here over in Southeast Asia. Until March this year, the World Health Organization and UNICEF would be telling us that there are 150 million people living on the planet who have suffered FGM. In March, it went up 50 million because they suddenly realised it was happening in Indonesia, which we've been telling them for ages, but nobody took any notice. So basically, we have 200 million girls and women worldwide have been subjected to FGM. And as these affected communities have migrated and moved around, you will see here in Europe, although it's a pale green, there is FGM in particular minority enclaves, as they call it on this map. So this is an issue that affects us here in Europe. Predominantly, the practice is concentrated in 30 African, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries, as we can see from the map. If we look at 3 countries in particular, half of those 200 million women live in only 3 countries. So if we were to get rid of FGM in 3 countries, that is Indonesia, Egypt, and Ethiopia, we would reduce the problem by half, if that makes sense. In 8 countries in the world, over 80% of women aged 15 to 49 have been subjected to FGM. And I'll just read the countries out. Somalia, Guinea, Djibouti, Sierra Leone, Mali, Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea. I'm reading those out because we all, in all of our countries where we come from, have migrants or communities that come from those areas living amongst us. And they are bringing their cultural practices with them. Each year, 3 million girls are at risk of having FGM. If we look at Europe in particular, the European Parliament in 2008 calculated that there were 500,000 women and girls living in the European Union who had been subjected to FGM. I think that's a real underestimate, because half of those live in the UK alone. So, and we know that there are at least 2 other countries above us in the league table in Europe for the numbers of women who we think are suffering from, have survived FGM. So it's a real issue. So in 2009, the European Union, we put in a bid to the European Union to see if we could investigate what was going on. And then we're going back, quite a while now. And basically, we were trying to answer the question, why has the ending of FGM in the European Union and elsewhere proven so difficult? It's a cultural tradition that is proving extremely resistant to change, and I've had conversations over the last 24 hours, and in some countries it's actually making we were talking about Kenya earlier, it's actually coming back up. We know that's the case in Egypt, we know it's the case in other parts of the world. Certainly on the up in Europe. And the question we were trying to ask ourselves was, why is it that despite the widespread campaigning that there has been in Europe against FGM, the fact that it's a criminal offence in all countries in the European Union, some more recently than others, why is it that FGM continues to be practiced on women and girls who are resident in the EU? Why is that happening? Why aren't the messages getting through? I could go on forever, but part of what we were doing, we did some research as to why that was the case, and I haven't got, as I said, haven't got time to give you all the information because I want to get onto the model that we've developed. But we did research with communities in five different European countries. With, I can tell you the ethnic groups. We looked at the Sudanese and Somali communities in the UK, the Somali community in the Netherlands, the Senegal and Gambian community in Spain, Guinea-Bissau in Portugal, and the Eritrean and Ethiopian communities in Italy. So those were our communities that we focused on. So quite a wide variety. And we did some research to try and understand what was motivating parents to have their daughters cut, even though those parents were living in Europe. I haven't got time to go into all of that. This is a really, really brief summary. But what we found very much linked in with what the WHO had said in 1999, their mental map of FGM. These are the reasons they felt that the parents were using to justify the practice. As I said, I haven't got time to go into the results, but we found that all of these reasons, we heard them all again and again in different communities. What we found then was that FGM is motivated by a very complex mix of interrelated socio-cultural factors, including religion, or being justified by religion, whether it's true or whether it is or not, but that's what people are telling us, hygiene and aesthetics, social acceptance, marriageability, womanhood, a right into womanhood, etc., etc. And all of those were combined to maintain the practice in European diaspora communities. In other words, FGM is a social norm. And I've stressed this because very often in the European context, we regard these issues as being an issue that affects individuals. We have the health belief model, very much, bring the mother in, tell her it's not on, it's bad for the health of the child, and that mother won't do it. We don't understand very often, so I'm being rude, I hope, not insulting anybody. The people I've spoken to in the medical profession don't always understand that these practices are perpetuated by the community, by the social norm. That individuals can't always make the decision not to do something. So, FGM is a social norm. Individuals' actions are interdependent on the actions of others, including family and wider community. And I've really strongly talked about wider community, and I don't just mean the wider community in the European Union. I'm talking about the wider community back home as well. Lots of pressures coming from migrant communities in the European Union from the homelands, especially with social media, TV, satellite telly, all of those things. Very, very powerful. Nice quote here which really just explains what that social norm means. And I'll just read it out. It's a UNICEF quote, which I quite like, and I couldn't think of a better way of saying it. So, even when parents recognise that FGM can cause serious harm, the practice persists because they fear moral judgments and social sanctions should they decide to break with society's expectations. Parents often believe that continuing FGM is a lesser harm than dealing with these negative repercussions. That's a social norm. Okay, just so that we're all on the same page. So what did we do? We decided that we needed a new way to tackle FGM in the European Union. What we had done for the last 30 years plus clearly wasn't working. And our research suggested that that, in fact, was a true assumption. What we also did is we looked at lots of interventions, and we found that many of them were really, really good at raising awareness of the issue, but that was all they did. So one can be very, very well informed about the health issues, but that doesn't mean to say you're going to stop doing FGM. What it probably means is you're going to medicalise it, and that's what we found. Dubai and Singapore being places where girls are ferried off to from the UK, for example, to have a medical operation done. So we looked at what was currently being done. Awareness raising is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but what it wasn't doing is it wasn't then being translated into behavioural change. Okay? And the other thing we found is that many of the interventions, government and NGOs, were that they assumed that all FGM-affected communities were the same. Okay, they all did the same sort of FGM, and they did it for the same reasons. Well, they don't. And if you have the same intervention material for one group, it's going to be irrelevant for another. And what we found is that much of the material that was being used was focusing on type 3 FGM, the most serious form. And communities were saying, well, we do type 1 and 2, so that's not FGM. You know, and therefore all these awful things that you're going to say are going to happen to me as a daughter or a female are not going to happen because I don't do that, therefore it's okay. So there was all this sort of going on in the background. So our research confirmed that that FGM-affected communities are different. We found the Somali community, for example, in London is very different from the Somali community in Rotterdam, even though they come from the same heritage country, but the environment was different in those two countries, the political environment, the legal environment, etc., and the education environment. Each community had different belief systems, which instead of them just saying, oh, we do it for religious reasons, we delve deeper than that. I'll explain how we did, and actually most of them weren't for religious reasons, but that was the simple answer they gave us. And they have different enforcement mechanisms, and this is the thing about a social norm. Social norm is perpetuated by the enforcement mechanisms of the community. You're my community. I have a daughter. I think I have to have her cut. Because if I don't, you won't talk to me, or you might throw stones at me, or I won't be able to marry my daughter. But because we don't talk about FGM, I don't know that half of the room actually agree with me. They don't know that I agree with them, so we continue doing FGM. Do you understand? So that's sort of the enforcement from the community. It's a very much, sort of psychological issue as well as a physical issue. So we decided we had to try and look at this as a problem of social norm rather than an individual or family. This is much bigger than that. And that we have to look at a way of how we can challenge this social norm, not from the outside, not as, white, middle class academics and researchers or whatever, but to help those within the community to challenge what's going on. Because you're going to get more effective change if it comes from within. Who am I to go in there and tell them? They've been told it for 30 years, but it's still happening. Somebody else comes along from inside the community and basically says, actually, it's not in the Quran. They listen. If I say it, how would I know? I'm not a Muslim. Okay? So we're talking about working with communities here. And we have to target, and we realise that you have to target individuals, but you must also target communities or reference groups, as we would call them in social norms theory. So we came up with this approach, and this took us 5 years to come up with. We've trialled it, we've changed it, we've evaluated it, and it is being adopted. I can talk about that later. Basically, what we have is a 5-stage model. This is the ideal academic talking, of course. Basically, you start off with community engagement. You have to understand your community. You have to have access to that community. I can talk more about that later if anybody wants over coffee. But one of the most important things from that is understanding the social norm. Don't assume every community is the same. Okay? For example, we did some work in Bristol in the UK with Somali and Sudanese communities. They lived together. They all said they did it for the same reasons. But when we started to interrogate them a bit further, we found that in the Somali community in general, women were not re-infibrillated after giving birth, but in the Sudanese community they were. And when we asked why, and we were the first project, I think I'm being a bit big-headed here, to include men in our research, the Sudanese men said they insisted on their wives being re-infibrillated for male sexual satisfaction. Somalis didn't do that. Okay, so I mean, and they were living in the same streets as each other. So you need to understand those nuances there. Then we had the problem of, right, well, if we're going to put in place a behavioural change approach, so basically we have community participatory action research up here, and then we devise some interventions which include behavioural change theory to try and get this circle moving round. So we want to change people's behaviour to end FGM. It won't happen in one cycle. It might just be in little cycles, many cycles. But our problem was, well, we can measure how individuals change their attitudes or behaviour. There's lots of ways of doing that. But how do we measure social norm change? How do we know we're being effective? And we found that there was hardly any methodology. So how do you know if you're putting in place the right intervention, I'll use the word intervention, right activity? And then obviously an important part of this is that you have to evaluate so you can go round again and change a little bit at a time to get to the goal that you want. So this was one of the challenges we had. How do we measure community attitudinal change? And I'm just going to focus on that in the next couple of slides, just to, because I hope somebody's going to tell me they've done this before, but we haven't come across this being done before in this way. So we looked at what was out there, and we found a model that's developed in the US by Plested and company in, I think it was University of Colorado, and they developed a community readiness to change index looking at domestic violence. And we couldn't find anything, but so we used that as the foundation and we adapted it for FGM. And their model comprised 6 dimensions of community readiness to change. Okay, so they're basically saying all of these need to be addressed if you're going to get change. But clearly some will get change quicker than others. And if you look at them, we haven't got time, they incorporate knowledge, attitude, practice, knowledge, attitude, practice. Okay, it's that sort of idea. Okay. And then those translate into 9 stages of change. So by scoring those, you can then equate where a community is in terms of one of these 9 stages, which range from no community awareness of FGM, they're in denial, it's a social norm, they don't want to change, through to a community which has basically changed its social norm and doesn't do FGM anymore, and various stages in between. So what we did, well, I haven't got time to go into all the detail, we worked with communities, and we did this in a number of ways, but there's a sheet of questions. There's 3 questions per dimension of change, and we just asked people in the community to tell us where they think their community is with respect to those dimensions, out of 1 to 3 or whatever. So it's very crude, easy to do, very crude. And basically, if the score was low on all of those 6 dimensions, and these are representative peoples of communities, these are not necessarily people who are advocating to end FGM, this is, a representative group, then there's no community awareness right the way through. So do you understand how that works? And by scoring each of those 6, you can see which ones you need to focus on in your intervention. Are you following me? Sorry, I have to do this so quickly. So you might find, well, they know a lot about efforts to end FGM, but they don't know who's leading those efforts. So there's no point then telling them even more knowledge about those efforts. You need to tell them who the leaders are. Are you with me? So you have to tailor your intervention to that particular community. And I'll come to the intervention in a second. So basically, these 9 stages equate to changing social norms. Okay, they might not be evenly spaced like this. It might speed up, of course. Okay, I'm nearly at the end. So complicated to explain in a short amount of time. So once you have put communities into one of 9 stages of change. We then looked at them and thought, well, if they're in stages 1 to 3, I think not really, they're quite resistant to change, they probably do need knowledge, they need awareness raising. You know, they do need to know. We certainly found this with the community in Italy. They were Eritrean and Ethiopians. Many of them had just come off boats and had awful experiences. And, you know, FGM wasn't an issue, you know, it's a high enough issue on their agenda. They didn't understand it was against the law in Europe and all of those sorts of things. So they need awareness raising. Then, if in stages 4 to 5, they don't need any more awareness raising. They need help in changing attitudes and behaviours towards FGM. And then in stages 7 to 9, that change needs to be supported so that it can continue and become a social norm. Okay, so that's how, sorry, I have to rush through this. So if we put all of that together, so this is the 6 dimensions, stages of readiness, is a slightly different colour, I apologise. We can then push that down into what type of intervention we should be implementing with those communities. Okay, so it's quite logical to see you're nodding, so hopefully I'm making some sense. So you should be able to, by doing quite a quick, dirty, if you like, assessment, have a clearer idea of targeting your intervention more closely. And I'm just going to, I've only got 2 more slides, so you'll be pleased to know. This is just the results that we had, or an example of what we did. These are our 5 communities that we were working with. This is the stage of readiness that we assessed them at, or they assessed themselves at. They then led into interventions to plug the gaps that we were finding back here. Does that make some sense? Okay? So, for example, our Eritrean and Ethiopian community was a very transient community. There wasn't a real community spirit there. People were coming off boats and they just wanted to go to Germany and Britain and France. You know, it was just, they were suffering racism and all sorts of, horrible things were happening to them. So we thought, well, the last thing they want to hear about is FGM, but what they do need to know about is how to get together and talk about issues that are common to them, and we can drop in the FGM. So we tried to encourage them to have coffee clubs or whatever, try to form communities there, get people to talk about what it's like to be in Europe, and we help them with asylum status and all those sorts of things. Through to the one that we had in the Netherlands had the highest readiness to end FGM, and there we found that people were saying, we don't want to do FGM, but the Quran says we have to do it. Okay, so and even we were working with FSAN, some of you might know, could not crack this nut, and so basically we said, okay, well, how can we change this view, correct it, because people are not listening or they don't feel confident, and we came up with the idea that we would put on a training course for Quranic school teachers, both men and women. Most of the men dropped out actually, but men and women. And we put together a curriculum, and part of that curriculum meant producing a DVD with a Quranic scholar from the University of Rotterdam, so that it was basically him telling them what was in the Quran and in the Hadiths, not somebody else. So that's just an example of how that linked across to the readiness index. I mean, the hope is that communities will work through this, not necessarily with the same interventions, but they will work through. So the idea is that after you've done an intervention, that you would then do the community readiness index again to see if there's been any progress. And in each of the communities we worked with, there was progress. It was only slight in some, but there was a move towards change. The hope is that it would speed up as we move towards a tipping point. We found much greater moves in terms of attitude of individuals, but their behaviour was constrained by the community still at that point. So you have to do both because individuals can't act on their own. So in conclusion, we think that the community readiness assessment is useful. It's one of the few tools out there, and we know it works. And it can evaluate community behaviour and be quite not specific, but it can identify differences within communities and help target. When there's limited resource, you need to target. You can't afford to make mistakes, whatever. We've shown that it's effective. It's been taken up by a number of local authorities across Europe, actually, and European projects, including Change Plus and others. So it has, and we've been praised by the European Union as an example of good practice. Didn't fund the next project, but that's another matter. Maybe that's because of Brexit. I did apply in June. And we didn't get it. Not that I'm bitter and twisted. I think it can really help in the development of appropriate interventions, rather than the same old leaflet going out all the time. Let's target and let's get some behavioural change in there. And if we use it at regular intervals, before, after, and maybe 3 months or 6 months after an intervention, we can see if that is really progressing, or do we need to do that again? And if they have progressed, the next intervention will be something more behavioural change focused rather than awareness raising. So I just wanted to share that with you. I'm sorry that was a real gallop, and I've probably overrun. But I just thought it was useful to share some sort of methodological insight with you that might stimulate people. It's very qualitative. But it is easy to use, and it does work. Sorry, Patrick, I overran.